Welcome to NCIX Tech Tips. We're going to be doing a full gaming system build guide. Now, we're going to be doing a very extreme build because this will show you a lot of the different things you could run into with a more complicated build. However, the same principles will apply for a basic system build as well. So at the heart of our machine today is Intel's Core i7 Extreme Edition 3960X, and everything else you see around here is going to be built around this little tiny thing that delivers 6 cores and 12 threads of processing power to whatever it is you want to do. The parts we chose were all for very specific reasons. So when you're getting an Extreme Edition CPU, you're going to want an Extreme motherboard. We went with the Rampage 4 Extreme. This is ASUS's highest-end Republic of Gamers motherboard. You're also going to need a great cooling solution, so we've gone with the Corsair H100. This is a dual-fan, dual-radiator, liquid cooling solution. Again, memory, Corsair Dominator Platinums. We've got 4 DIMMs. This is a quad-channel memory platform, so this is only 1600 megahertz RAM, but we're going to have 16 gigs of it, and it's going to be running in quad-channel for uber bandwidth. We're also going with 2 Neutron GTX 240 gig SSDs, so those are right there. So we're going to have a total of a 480 gig RAID 0 boot drive, but you got to be careful with RAID 0. You want to make sure you're backing it up. So for storage and backup, we're going to go with a RAID 10 of 4 Western Digital 3 terabyte drives. So we're going to have 6 terabytes of high performance, fully redundant storage to go along with this. For power, you need something extreme again. For an extreme build like this, we've gone with what we think is pretty much the highest end power supply out there. Corsair's AX1200i. This is an 80 Plus Platinum, fully modular power supply. For video cards, we've stepped down a little bit. We haven't gone with dual GTX 680s, we've gone with dual GTX 670s. Especially after overclocking, you can get a lot of the performance of a 680 with a 670, and by running 2 of them, you can actually get tremendous value out of your gaming machine, although I guess a lot of the aspects of this gaming machine aren't necessarily about value, but don't worry about that. Dual 670s is a great solution. We're going with an ASUS Zonar Essence STX sound card. This is the ultimate sound card for gamers who use headphones, and we've gone with a Cooler Master half series case to make sure that we are going to get the cooling we need to make all of this work correctly. Step 1 for me is always assembling the critical components outside of the PC case to ensure that they work correctly. If you don't have a test bench, grab your motherboard box, put it on the table, now you've got a test bench. Modern Intel motherboards have the pins inside the socket. So the first thing you'll have to do is remove the plastic covering from the CPU socket. So we'll do overlays to show you 2011 and 1155 procedures for this. Ensuring that you're grounding yourself before making contact with any critical electronic components. That means touching a plugged-in power supply, or in the case of myself, I have a grounding strap around my ankle. Next step is to install the CPU in the socket. Intel CPUs have a small gold triangle that should be aligned with the triangle on the CPU socket. So you remove the lever arms, pull up the hold-down plate, position the CPU very carefully in the socket. You should not be applying any force as you insert it. Once it's in place, just give it a small, slight wiggle to make sure that it's in there. Put down the mounting plate, and then put down either the 1 or 2 lever arms, depending on whether you're using LGA 1155 or 2011. Placing the CPU into the socket. Make sure it's in place. Thermal compound is an essential part of any PC. Once the CPU is installed, you want to take a thin line of thermal compound and apply it down the center of the CPU, like so. Whether you're using an aftermarket cooler like a water cooler or not, like I said, I recommend testing on a test bench, so grab your stock heatsink that usually comes with your CPU and go ahead and throw that on there. Always tighten the corners first. So a little bit tight in this corner, a little bit tight in the opposite corner, and then go slowly like this to make sure that you're not putting unnecessary pressure on the CPU from any particular direction. If your CPU cooler mounts with push pins, you're going to want to follow the same principles. The pins will come in the correct orientation out of the box and press on the opposite corners at the same time to get a secure mount without undue pressure. Once the CPU heatsink is attached, you can go ahead and take the 4-pin connector for the fan and plug it into the CPU fan header on your motherboard. It's usually labeled CPU and is nearby the CPU socket. RAM installation is pretty straightforward. In fact, the trickiest part of RAM installation is choosing which memory to get. If you have a dual channel motherboard, you want to get either 2 or 4 sticks. If you have a triple channel motherboard, you want 3 or 6. And if you have a quad channel motherboard, you want either 4 sticks or 8 sticks to ensure that you're getting the most out of it. All you really have to do, and you can consult your motherboard manual if you're not sure which slots to populate first, is find the color-coded slots, put the stick into one side if you have sort of easy install slots, otherwise open both tabs, and then position the memory, making sure to line up the notch on the bottom of the module with the notch on the bottom of the motherboard, and then press evenly on both sides of the memory until it clicks into place. Now, for the purposes of figuring out if the system's going to post before we put it in the case, we're just going to install one of our GTX 670 graphics cards. You're going to notice that it droops a little bit to the side. We're only running it temporarily like this, so we're not going to worry too much about it. Because we're using a fully modular power supply, we have a bag of optional cables. However, your power supply might have the cables pre-attached. Be careful when you're plugging these cables into the power supply. The ends will be labeled according to whether it plugs into the motherboard or whether it plugs in to the PSU itself. So in this case, we've attached only the cables we need in order to do our bare bones test on the system ahead of installing it into the case. Now, the bare minimum cables we'll need to get the system going are the 24-pin. This is the main power connector for the motherboard, and it should be fairly evident where that plugs into. There's only going to be one option for that. We're also going to need PCI Express power cables for our graphics card. Sometimes these are going to be 8-pin, sometimes they're going to be 6-pin. You have to plug in exactly what you see on your graphics card. This is not like the connector I'm about to show you, where you can plug a 6-pin cable into an 8-pin slot and have it still work. You have to make sure you got the right stuff. The next part is your 8-pin or your 4-pin connector. Many motherboards have only a 4-pin connector, in which case you're just going to plug in a single 4-pin, just like this. Many motherboards have a single 8-pin connector, in which case you can plug a 4-pin into the slots where it fits, or you can plug in an 8-pin. In this case, our motherboard has an 8-pin and a 4-pin to deliver extra power to the CPU. You can plug in either the 8-pin or both of them in order to deliver that extra current. Some motherboards also have auxiliary connectors, whether it's a 4-pin Molex or whether it's a 6-pin PCIe that can provide additional power to the PCI Express slots for multi-way graphics configurations. In this case, I would recommend using it if you're going to have 3 graphics cards or more. And as you can see, no keyboard detected. This we know. We don't have a keyboard installed, but the system boots up, so we're ready to start assembling it properly. Now, I've received a lot of emails and messages over the years about things like, okay, Linus, I bought a hard drive, it didn't include screws, or I bought a motherboard and it didn't include mounting screws. All the hardware you need to assemble your computer comes with your case, usually in a box like this, attached somewhere inside. This will be everything you need, and your case should also come with a manual that explains what all the different screws are for. However, for the most part, it's pretty straightforward. The thing that fits into the other thing goes into that thing. First step is to install the power supply into, in this case, the bottom of the case. Power supply is installing cases in a lot of different ways these days, but we're going to go in with the bottom mounted case. Also, you can either orient the fan up or down depending on how your case is configured. In this case, I can do either, but I'm going to orient it down because that way the power supply will always be taking in 100% fresh air through the filtered intake on the bottom and won't have to suck hot air away from my GTX 670 graphics card that's going to be right next to it. To ensure your power supply doesn't move around once you've installed it, you want to screw in the 4 screws at the back. You'll notice that most cases have 8 screw holes at the back. That's to accommodate those 2 different mounting orientations that I talked about before. Case motherboard compatibility is another question that I get a lot. An ATX case is capable of natively mounting an ITX motherboard, an MATX motherboard, or a full-sized ATX motherboard without any difficulty. The only thing you have to change around is you have to examine your board closely to find where the mounting holes are, and then position the mounting standoffs inside the motherboard tray in the correct locations. They're usually coded with an A or a B or some other denotation that is written on the motherboard tray itself. In this case, we're going to be mounting a slightly EATX motherboard. It's a little bit wider than ATX that has ATX mounting holes. So we'll be following the ABC EFGMNO code here and installing all of our motherboard standoffs. Once we've determined which holes to use, I use a socketed screwdriver. But this case actually comes with a very handy adapter piece for your screwdriver that slips over the standoffs and then allows you to use a Phillips head to drive them into the motherboard tray. Now here's a super handy trick. There's no real standard for what threading motherboard standoffs use, and different manufacturers use different threads. So I always do a quick check before I try to install the board with the screw that I think goes in, and then make sure it threads in properly before I try to install the board. In Cooler Master's case with the half XM, they've had the courtesy here to take all the standoffs and all the motherboard mounting screws and put them in the same little baggie. So kudos to Cooler Master for that little attention to detail with this particular case. I always recommend laying down the case before installing the motherboard, because the last thing you want is to put the motherboard on top of all the standoffs and then have it slip. That could scratch the back of your board and damage it to the point where it would no longer function. Before installing the motherboard, you want to put your I/O shield into the case. This is a little bit tricky sometimes, but I usually line up one of the corners and then snap in each of the other 3 corners individually. Make sure it's in there good though, because if it's loose, it can cause problems when you actually put the motherboard in. So we're hand camming this because I couldn't figure out a smart way to lay down the case and install a motherboard and have you guys be able to see it. So it's really important not to put any pressure down on this motherboard because it's like sitting on these metal standoffs. I usually use a heatsink that's screwed in or some other secure mounting point to position the board, holding it slightly off the standoffs. You want to keep it angled like this. Put the I/O through the I/O sheet or the I/O plate, okay? And then slide down the other side, keeping a careful eye on these holes to ensure that they are positioned correctly. If they are positioned correctly, you can see these little metal pieces around the mounting holes. Those will protect them if you're off by just a little bit. But if you're off by a lot, it's going to be a big problem for your motherboard, scratching the traces or whatever else. Once you've got it positioned correctly, I usually put in this screw first because this middle screw will hold the board pretty much in place while you then relax yourself and screw in the other, in this case, 8 mounting screws. Now we've got an Extreme Edition, which means we'd have to be like, to not be overclocking it. I mean, come on, you spent $1,000 on a CPU, not gonna overclock it. Crazy. Okay, so we're gonna go with an H100. Dual fan cooler, awesome stuff. Comes with lots and lots of mounting hardware that could get a little bit confusing, but I want to show you the main parts first. So these 2 fans are going to be configured in a pole configuration. We're going to mount them in the top of the case. Then the radiator itself is going to sit right near the memory slots. All this mounting hardware here, there's your AMD mounting hardware, comes with the Intel mounting hardware built in. They've got great instructions that come with it, so we're not going to go through everything, but basically, we just need to pick out these 4 pieces that are going to screw in around the motherboard socket. Then we need these 4 thumb screws to actually secure the bracket to our 2011 platform. So it's incredibly easy to do, and it also comes with thermal compound pre-applied, which means we're going to wipe off using isopropyl alcohol, the thermal compound that we were using for the stock heatsink. Okay, so here's the prep part where we take these pieces right here, look like that. And this is a special mechanism. The H100 mounts completely differently on all the other sockets. So you put in these 4 pieces, and then we're ready to keep going with our build. I always recommend plugging in the little delicate connectors before doing the big bulky ones because it's often harder to get at them once you've installed a bunch of other random stuff. So we've got our front USB 3, which is using a front panel header. Some cases still have a USB 3 pass-through that goes around the back of the board and plugs into the back. We've also got our front panel audio, where the header is usually located around the back of the board in sort of this neighborhood. We've got our front USB 2, and watch carefully for your USB 2 ports. Some of them are color-coded to provide extra power for charging devices like tablets without any slower charging compared to what you'd normally see on a USB port. And finally, your front panel connectors. So that includes your hard drive LED, your power, your reset, and your power LED. Now, if the cables are all black on your case, it can be a little bit trickier, but they should be labeled with plus and minuses. And in your motherboard manual, you can actually find a diagram of which connectors are which. On high-end motherboards, like the Rampage 4 Extreme that we're using today, they're actually all labeled on the motherboard itself, so I'm able to do it without any assistance. Next, we're going to install some of the cables that will become more difficult once we put things like graphics cards and CPU heatsinks all over the place that make it so our hands don't fit as easily into the machine. So the 24-pin connector is routed around the back of the motherboard tray through the cable routing hole here in the bottom, and then the same goes for our 8-pin connector and the 4-pin connector, because this motherboard has both. Now it's time to install drives, because those are some of the other power and data cables we're going to need to run before we put things like graphics cards in. So we are going to be loading this case right up. There's 2 hot swap bays in the front, but because we're using like 3 terabyte drives and 240 gig SSDs, you know what? We trust the people around us, but we don't necessarily trust them that much. You know, hot swap bays are cool and everything, but we're going to go with loading up all of our legitimate hard drive cages. So in the case of the half XM case, all of these sleds are capable of either mounting a 2.5-inch drive with screws and then sliding it into the case, or mounting a 3.5-inch drive without screws, just by sliding it in on one side and then clipping in on the other side before installing it back into the case and locking it in. Now bear with me guys, because we haven't done any cable management on the back of the motherboard tray yet, but we need to run our SATA power. So because we have 6 drives, we're going to need 2 of those modular cables that came with the case. Make sure you orient them so that you don't have to sort of twist around the cables. Because if I'd taken that first one and plugged it in at the top, then every time I try to move down, I'm going to have to twist it around like this, and it's weird. There's usually a natural way for these ribbon-style cables to go from one drive to another and have it be very, very clean, just like that. So when you try to close the other side panel, you're not going to have any difficulty. Done with power cables for now, so we needed 6 SATA data cables. So, okay, I've plugged them all into the back of the drives. Now I'm running them through to the motherboard, where we're going to plug them in on the other side. The tricky part is all on the motherboard side, because while all of these drives, the hard drives and the SSDs, are SATA 3 6 gigabit per second compliant drives, only the SSDs are actually going to get any benefit from the additional speed. So you can consult your motherboard manual, or you can read what the ports are underneath them, but it is very important to plug your SSDs into the SATA 3 6 gigabit per second ports on your motherboard, and the hard drives into the SATA 2 3 gigabit per second ports in order to get the best performance out of your SSDs. Now it's time to install our H100 cooler, being sure to align it correctly with the mounting holes in the top. What we have to do with this case, although this isn't always how it works, is we actually have to put the fans on the other side of the metal of the case, being careful to orient the fans such that their power cables are going to be able to reach down to where they need to go to get power. Once we've positioned everything correctly, we use at least 4 screws, so we'll do the 2 ends of the radiator, and we want to go all the way through the fans to the radiator, making sure we don't go too far and end up puncturing the fins, in order to secure the rad in place when we can install the rest of the screws. Installing the cooler in this case is a little tricky, because there's a metal piece that's going to go in between the fans and the cooler. Normally we wouldn't do that, but it's just the way this one's configured. So what I've done is I've taken the fans, I've run the cables through the cable routing holes so that they'll have access to power down the back of the motherboard tray, keep everything nice and tidy. And then I've put 4 screws through the fans so that when I position the radiator in the correct spot here, carefully of course, because there's, you know, my 8-pin power connector that's a little bit in the way. It's a little tight, but we will have adequate room for cooling. I'm just gonna lift that up a little bit here. Okay, yeah, it's all good, it's all good. Don't worry guys, this is going exactly according to plan. It can be a little tough to mount these radiator coolers, but you know, just lift up the fan a little bit, make sure the screw is positioned correctly. There we go. And just kind of start the threading there so the radiator doesn't fall away, and then you're ready to go. So you just take all 8 screws, tighten them up, and your rad is mounted. Believe it or not, we're getting very close to the end. All we have to do is remove the protective covering on our CPU water block pump combo unit. Go ahead and screw the 4 screws into place around the outside of it. So you gotta kind of keep a finger on it to hold it in place, and then at least get them finger tight to start with, which I'm having a little bit of trouble with here, but you know, you guys will probably have it laid down flat so that you don't have to worry about holding it in place. That's probably a better way to do it. Okay, there we go. So let's get those on there. Also, you have to run 2 more cables off of the cooler. So there's a total of 4. 2 for the fans, 1 for the pump RPM monitor. The pump, in the case especially of something like the H100, is actually more important than the fans because the odds of 2 fans failing is pretty slim. Whereas you want to monitor the RPM of that pump with your motherboard so that your motherboard has a chance to shut down if the pump fails, because that's more of a single point of failure. Also, through the same hole that we have our 8-pin going through, we have the Molex power connector that powers the pump, and we're going to plug that in again at the back of the motherboard tray to keep things nice and tidy inside. Now, because the H100 has a built-in controller for the fans, you just press this button right in the middle of it, we're going to plug those directly into the power supply. However, for the other fans in the case, the front fan and the rear fan, we're going to plug them directly into the motherboard because ASUS motherboards have fan controlling and monitoring software that is actually excellent in their AI Suite application. So you just find a 4-pin fan connector, doesn't matter, 4-pin, 3-pin header, and then you plug the fan connector into it. Next up is expansion slots. You want to be really careful when you're planning out in the process of purchasing your motherboard, as well as when you're building the machine, which slots you're using for which cards. So we're installing our add-in sound card in this particular slot. It looks like a PCIe 16X slot. However, electrically it's an 8X slot, which doesn't matter because our 1X card will work in an 8X slot, no problem. Okay, but the reason we've selected this one is because once we install our 2 graphics cards, we want them to have some breathing room next to them so that they can actually get some airflow through these fans. So that's why this slot has been chosen. Also, this is an optional step. If you have an add-in sound card, you're going to want to run that cable from where we plugged it into the onboard audio. Instead of plugging it into that, you're going to want to run it up to your add-in sound card so you get that better quality sound from your front panel. Now it's time for graphics card installation. You can see I've put one of them in already. That one wasn't going to be very easy to show you. But once we line it up with the PCI Express slot, we just have to make sure we're pressing evenly and firmly. Okay, you can tell if it's all the way in because the PCIe lock at the back of the slot will raise, and the slots should be lined up with the screw holes near the back of the case. So one of the last connectors that we're going to plug in is the PCI Express power connectors. The reason I always install graphics cards last is because once they're in, it's almost impossible to access anything else, whether it's your front panel connectors or whether it's your SATA connectors or anything. So once those big honking graphics cards are in there, everything else becomes a real chore. So we're just plugging all those. I mean, we showed you this close up earlier, so we're not going to worry too much about it. Once that's done, all that's really left now is to go around the back of the case and tidy up, whoa, that mess of wires, as well as running a couple Molex connectors to those fans on the top, as well as the pump for our H100. got our last connector to plug in. You guys may have noticed that we don't have an optical drive. So if we did, we'd obviously have to run another SATA connector and more power up to the optical bays. But like many users these days, I find myself using an optical drive less and less. So as part of an extreme build, I don't necessarily consider an optical drive to be essential anymore. Besides, you can always get an external optical drive and then use it on all of the computers in your house whenever the need comes up. In a modern case, there's pretty much no excuse for not doing at least a little bit of rudimentary cable management. So in this case, we've used the loops on the back of the motherboard tray to keep all the cables flat enough that we can take our side panel and close it without any difficulty. So I mean, everyone's probably done this at some point if you're an experienced builder. That game where you lay the case down and then you sit on it like a suitcase in order to get the panel closed. Not necessary as long as you keep those cables down flat. It's finishing touches time, guys. 10 points to yourself and Gryffindor if you can guess what the last thing I need to do is. And I kind of gave you a hint when I picked up the last thing I need to put in. So I have to install an SLI bridge. There we go. And now we're ready to cover the top. However, I firmly believe that it is bad computer building luck, and I'm not normally superstitious, but it is bad computer building luck to close the last side panel before you power it on. So let's find out if the machine boots. So this is pretty much going to be our wrap-up shot. I'm going to let Diesel take some, glamour shots of my awesome handiwork on this build. Mind you, if you watch this video, you can easily build a machine just like what I've done. I showed you guys every step along the way. So yeah, I think it looks pretty fly. Looks pretty fly. A lot of it has to do with the component selection, making sure everything works great together. A lot of it has to do with, well, the bling bling. You want components that look awesome. You have like underglow lighting effects on your Dominator memory. You got extra LEDs on your graphics cards. Yeah, you have to get kind of premium components. I'm going to show you guys one last step, and that is the configuration of the storage system here. I'm not going to show you overclocking because I've already done a separate episode about 3960X overclocking, and I won't be showing Windows 7 installation because I've already done an episode about installing Windows 7 in the past, so you can check those out if you get a chance, and maybe Diesel will even give you guys a couple links to those videos. And let's go into advanced SATA configuration, and we're going to change from AHCI mode to RAID mode. Once that's done, we're just going to save our BIOS settings, and we'll be back in a moment. Control-I is all we have to press in order to get into the RAID configuration screen, so you can see our two 240 gig Neutron GTX drives, as well as our 4 Western Digital RAID Series 3 terabyte drives. We're going to create 2 RAID volumes. So we're going to create our RAID 0 GTX volume. This is going to be a RAID 0 stripe. We've got to select our disks using spacebar. Enter means we're done. Strip size really depends on the kind of load you're going to put on it. Something like 32 kilobytes as the default is going to be suitable for OS use, whereas if you were going to, see the recommended values are here. So a larger strip size is going to be great for if you were using it as a scratch disk for very large files for video editing, but OS use, so we want smaller strips. Actually, let's go with 64. And then we are going to create a volume with the entire capacity. Boom, RAID 0. Now, RAID 0 is not secure. One of those drives dies, all your data is gone. So we're going to use our RAID 10. Really? No 0? There we go. RAID 10. RAID 10, 0 plus 1. We're going to go like this. We're going to go with a... Oh, it automatically selected the disk, right, because you need at least 4 disks for RAID 10. If you want to use 3 disks with redundancy, RAID 5 is the solution, but it's much slower, especially for writing. So we're going to have a 5.3 terabyte RAID 10 volume that has the speed of RAID 0, the redundancy of RAID 1, and we can use that to do regular backups using something like CrashPlan or even Windows's built-in applications to make sure that even if our SSDs die, we're not going to lose too much data. So that's how to configure the drives. You're now ready to go. Thank you for checking out this long and hopefully detailed build guide on how to build your own PC featuring the Intel 3960X Extreme Edition processor. And yeah, so Diesel, take it away with some glamour shots of the inside of this tower because it's like awesome.